In 1519, Hernán Cortés made a controversial pact. He allied with the Tlaxcalans, the Aztec Empire's fiercest rivals. Their tens of thousands of warriors tipped the scales. Without them, the Spanish stood no chance. But what drove the Tlaxcalans to fight alongside foreigners against their own people? And after victory, did betrayal follow? Join us to uncover the overlooked story of native collaboration, its hidden motives, and its brutal aftermath. For centuries, the Aztec Empire had dominated the Valley of Mexico with an iron fist. From their magnificent island capital of Tenochtitlan, they ruled a vast tributary network that stretched from coast to coast. The city itself was a marvel of engineering, crisscrossed by canals and linked to the mainland by 3 great causeways. In its heart lay the Templo Mayor, where thousands of captives were sacrificed to appease the gods. The empire thrived on conquest and tribute, but beneath its splendor simmered deep resentment among subjugated peoples. The tributary system was brutal. Conquered cities sent not just gold, cacao, and cotton, but also young men and women for sacrifice or slavery, a constant grinding humiliation that fueled hatred. The Aztec creation myth told of the god Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent who had sailed eastward, vowing to return one day, and his prophecy cast a long shadow over the mind of Emperor Moctezuma Chuo. For years, strange omens had troubled him: a comet, a lightning strike on a temple, reports of a 2-headed man, and as word of foreign ships reached his court, many wondered if the god had come back to reclaim his throne. Moctezuma's indecision, born from a mix of religious awe and political calculation, would prove fatal to his empire. He was a complex ruler, deeply pious, prone to self-doubt, and acutely aware of the fragility of his throne. The omens plagued him. He consulted his wise men, who could offer no comfort, and he ordered the collection of tribute to appease the gods, but the unease never lifted. His response to the Spanish arrival was thus paralysis, rooted in a fear that divine retribution might follow any rash action. One such group was the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent confederation of 4 allied altepetls, or city-states, nestled in the mountains east of the Valley of Mexico. For decades, they had resisted Aztec expansion, enduring repeated invasions but never yielding. Their rugged homeland, protected by steep passes and thick pine forests, made a full conquest nearly impossible, so the Aztecs adopted a different strategy. They subjected Tlaxcala to a perpetual economic blockade, cutting off trade in salt, cotton, and other essentials, while waging so-called flower wars, ritualized conflicts whose real purpose was to capture sacrificial victims and keep the Tlaxcalans perpetually weak. This long-standing animosity made the Tlaxcalans ideal allies for any force that might challenge the Aztec hegemony, but it also left their society deeply divided between those who sought revenge and those who feared any outside entanglement. Within Tlaxcala, the Council of 4 leaders, each ruling one of the altepetls, did not speak with one voice. Some, particularly those from the wealthy trading city of Ocotelloco, saw potential in allying with any anti-Aztec force, while the more conservative mountain lords feared the disruption of their way of life. The debate was not just political but deeply personal, fueled by decades of grief and a burning desire to see their oppressors humbled. When Hernán Cortés and his small band of adventurers landed on the coast of Mexico in the early spring of 1519, they were not the first Spaniards to set foot there. Cortés was a man of reckless ambition, a disgraced magistrate turned fortune. Seeking conquistador, he had betrayed the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, by scuttling his own ships to prevent his men from turning back. With no lawful authority and a string of legal troubles behind him, he knew that only a spectacular success could save him from the hangman. His force was tiny, about 500 soldiers, 16 horses, a few cannons, and a pack of vicious war dogs, but they carried steel swords, harquebuses, and crossbows, technologies utterly foreign to the Americas. Before setting out, Cortés meticulously organized his forces. He drilled his men in formation, repaired their weapons, and bargained with local caciques for food and porters. He knew that his survival depended on winning native allies, and he had already picked up a crucial asset, a young enslaved woman named Malinche, who would become his interpreter and confidant, her linguistic gifts able to unravel the intricate web of Nahawa politics. Rumors of white-skinned strangers in floating houses had already reached the Aztec capital, sowing unease in Moctezuma's mind, and as Cortés moved inland, he quickly learned that the Aztec grip on the region was far from absolute. The coastal tonics, weary of Aztec tribute demands and the seizure of their young men for sacrifice, welcomed the strangers as potential liberators. Their city of Sempoala, with its white-plastered temples and bustling plazas, became Cortés's first firm foothold. He listened to their grievances, promised them protection, and in return gathered vital intelligence about the inland empire. Well, the Totonacs detailed the vast wealth of Tenochtitlan and the simmering hatred of its subjects, painting a picture of an empire ripe for disruption. Cortés, ever the opportunist, exploited these fissures with a blend of diplomacy, intimidation, and, when necessary, ruthless violence. His most decisive encounter, however, came when his column reached the borders of Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans, suspicious of these newcomers, initially attacked. In a series of sharp engagements, the Spanish technology steel swords that could slice through cotton armor, crossbows that punched through shields, and the terrifying shock of mounted cavalry proved its lethality. The Tlaxcalans had never seen a horse before. They believed rider and beast were a single monstrous creature. Yet they quickly adapted, learning to aim for the horse's legs and working in teams to pull riders down. After several bloody days, the Tlaxcalan Senate convened to weigh their options. Their leaders, including the elderly Xicotencatl the Elder and his son, Xicotencatl the Younger, debated fiercely. The Tlaxcalan Senate convened in the great council house of Tizatlan, its walls painted with the emblems of the four altepetls. Each lord brought his own warriors and his own fears. Xicotencatl the Elder, his voice trembling with age, recounted the long years of suffering under the Aztec yoke, the loss of sons in the flower wars, the constant hunger for salt and cotton that the blockade imposed. He warned that embracing the foreigners would only draw the wrath of Tenochtitlan upon them all. His son, a fiery warrior, initially agreed, leading several attacks, but after witnessing Spanish weaponry, he wavered. Others, especially a noble named Maxixcatzin, saw a historic opportunity. Maxixcatzin was a pragmatist and a visionary. He believed that these bearded warriors, with their thunderous weapons and strange beasts, could be the instrument to shatter the hated Aztec yoke. He argued that the Spanish were not gods but men who bled, and that their weapons, combined with Tlaxcalan numbers, could achieve what centuries of resistance could not. He pointed out that the Aztecs had never been weaker. Rumors of internal unrest, the costly flower wars, and the strange omens plaguing Moctezuma suggested a moment of divine fracture. The debate raged for 3 days, with messengers bringing news of Cortés' movements and Aztec troop deployments. In the end, the promise of plunder and the deep, abiding desire for revenge outweighed caution. After days of deliberation, the Tlaxcalan Senate made its fateful choice. They would ally with Cortés, but on their own terms. They demanded a share of any plunder, the reduction of Aztec power, and a recognition of Tlaxcala as an equal partner, not a conquered vassal. Vitasting never to sealed a bond, they gave Cortés noble daughters to cement a blood alliance, and thousands of warriors, porters, and scouts were placed under his command, each a CM. For Cortés, this was a godsend. The Tlaxcalans not only brought tens of thousands of battle-hardened warriors, but also intimate knowledge of Aztec defenses and tactics. They also provided food, porters, and, crucially, a safe haven to retreat to if things went wrong. The seeds of collaboration were sown in pragmatic self-interest, but they would soon bloom into one of the most consequential alliances in world history. Together, the unlikely army advanced toward Tenochtitlan. In the mountain passes, they encountered other cities, some hostile, some circumspect. The city of Cala, a major religious center allied to the Aztecs, became a dark milestone. Cala was home to the Great Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, a sacred site that drew pilgrims from across Mesoamerica. It had a long-standing alliance with the Aztecs, and its nobles were deeply suspicious of the Tlaxcalans, their ancient enemies, marching alongside these pale strangers. According to Spanish accounts, Cortés' indigenous interpreter Malinche learned from a Cayulan noblewoman of a planned ambush, and in a preemptive strike, Cortés and his allies launched a massacre, slaughtering thousands of Cayulan nobles and warriors in the main temple precinct. Recent scholarship suggests the attack may have also been intended to terrorize the region into submission. At a signal, the Spanish soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies sealed the exits of the main temple courtyard and fell upon the unarmed nobles and warriors. The slaughter was methodical and horrific, the paving stones slippery with blood. The brutal act sent shockwaves through the region. It demonstrated the terrifying power that the Tlaxcalans now had at their side, and it intimidated many other towns into submission without a fight. On November 8, 1519, the mixed force finally crossed the southern causeway into Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards were awestruck. The city, with its gleaming white temples, floating gardens, and humming markets where tens of thousands traded everything from cacao beans to jaguar pelts, seemed like an enchanted vision risen from the lake. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who recorded his experiences decades later, wrote that it was unlike anything they had seen, even in the great cities of Europe. For the Tlaxcalan warriors who had never seen such a city, it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Knew that within these glittering walls lurked the heart of the empire that had oppressed them for generations, and they eyed the Aztec lords with open hostility. Moctezuma, dressed in rich finery and carried in a litter, came out to meet them with a retinue of nobles. The exchange of gifts was opulent: gold, feathers, precious stones. According to Diaz, Moctezuma may have made a speech that hinted at submission, telling Cortés that his kingdom had long awaited a lord whose return was prophesied. Cortés, affable yet calculating, accepted the hospitality but held the emperor in a velvet grip. Within a week, Moctezuma was a prisoner in his own palace, the nominal ruler but effectively a hostage. For 6 months, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies lived in the heart of the empire, a tense parasitic occupation. The Tlaxcalans, accustomed to simpler fare, brawled with Aztec warriors in the markets and temples, while the Spaniards grew increasingly fearful of the overwhelming numbers surrounding them. The Aztec nobility seethed, and the city's mood grew darker. An incident that pushed everything to the brink was Cortés' sudden need to return to the coast. He learned that a much larger Spanish force under Panfilo de Narvaez had landed in Veracruz, sent by Governor Velázquez to arrest him for treason. Leaving a garrison in Tenochtitlan under his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado, Cortés marched away with a small picked force. In a brilliant night attack, he defeated Narvaez, promised the survivors a share in the riches of Mexico, and absorbed nearly 1,000 fresh soldiers along with horses and gunpowder. But his success came at a terrible cost. During his absence, Alvarado committed a catastrophic blunder. An Aztec religious festival was underway, and the temple courtyard filled with thousands of nobles, warriors, and dancers. Whether from suspicion of an uprising or simple greed for their gold ornaments, Alvarado sealed the exits and unleashed a massacre. The news of this unprovoked slaughter ignited a furious rebellion across the city. By the time Cortés returned, the streets were empty, the bridges destroyed, and the Aztecs were in full revolt. The Spanish and their allies were besieged in the palace, cut off from food and water. On the night of June 30, 1520, they attempted a desperate escape along the Tlacopan Causeway. It became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cortés had ordered a portable bridge to cross the gaps, but the device failed under the weight and chaos. Aztec warriors, in canoes and on foot, fell upon the fleeing column. The causeway was a chaos of screams, clashing steel, and splashing water as men and horses tumbled into the lake. The weight of stolen gold dragged many Spaniards to their deaths, while the Tlaxcalans and other native allies died in heaps, their bodies piling up against the causeway. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalans died that night, and many of the looted gold was lost. Moctezuma himself was killed, whether by Spanish hands or by stones thrown by his own enraged people remains disputed. The shattered remnants of the expedition staggered back to Tlaxcala, carrying their wounded and nursing their bitterness. The retreating army, broken and bleeding, faced a harrowing trek back to Tlaxcala. Aztec patrols harried them constantly, and the wounded died in droves from infection and exhaustion. The Spanish, disheartened, saw their dreams of gold turn to ash in their mouths. But the Tlaxcalans, though they too had suffered grievous losses, did not turn the survivors away. Their lands offered refuge, and their healers tended to the wounded with herbal remedies. This moment solidified the bond of shared trauma, but it also revealed the deep fractures within the alliance. Would the Tlaxcalans continue to back a losing cause? Cortés, through a mix of persuasion, bribery, and sheer force of personality, managed to hold it together, promising that with time and planning they would return and raise Tenochtitlan to the ground. Lesser men might have called it the end, but Cortés was not one to accept defeat. The Tlaxcalans, astonishingly, did not abandon him. Their leaders, despite the catastrophe, reaffirmed their commitment. The loss had only deepened their resolve to see the Aztec Empire dismantled. For the Tlaxcalans, this was a war of liberation, and they would see it through to the bitter end, even at the side of these strange bearded warriors who bled and died just like their own. Cortés, now with a renewed sense of purpose, laid out a meticulous plan to conquer the island city. He knew that a direct assault across the causeways would be suicidal. The Aztecs could simply destroy the bridges and rain projectiles from canoes. To win, he needed to control the water. So, in the safety of Tlaxcala, he ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, shallow draft sailing ships that could dominate Lake Texcoco. The timber was cut in the pine forests of Tlaxcala's mountains, and each piece was marked, shaped, and then carried in pieces by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters along a 50-mile route to the lake's edge. Over 3,000 men served as bearers, hauling timbers, iron fittings, and sails. They protected the route from Aztec raiders and fed the shipbuilders. Spanish carpenters, led by a man named Martín López, assembled the vessels in a makeshift shipyard on the lake shore, launching them with great ceremony and arming each with a small cannon. Martín López worked day and night, directing teams of carpenters and native laborers. The brigantines were flat-bottomed, designed for the shallow lake, and fitted with sails and oars. Each cannon had to be carefully loaded and aimed to fire over the low gunwales. The process took months, and all the while, Cortés busied himself with forging alliances with other cities. Messengers went out to Texcoco, Chalco, and other lake towns, promising a share of the spoils and freedom from Aztec domination. Slowly, the noose tightened. Meanwhile, a new and invisible ally was already at work inside Tenochtitlan, Smallpox. The disease had arrived with a Spanish soldier in 1520, and it swept through the densely packed city with terrifying speed. The Aztecs had no immunity. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who later recorded Aztec accounts, described the horror. It covered the body in pustules, and so many died that the living could not bury them. Among the victims was the new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, who had bravely led the resistance after Moctezuma's death. His reign lasted only 80 days before the disease took him, leaving the empire in the hands of a young but determined noble named Cuauhtémoc, a nephew of Moctezuma, who would become the heroic symbol of Aztec resistance. Cuauhtémoc, a charismatic and energetic leader, had the potential to rally the empire, but his sudden death threw the Aztecs into further confusion. The young Cuauhtémoc, though brave, lacked the political capital to hold the faltering alliance together. Many tributary towns, already wavering, began to see the writing on the wall and defected to the Spanish cause, bringing their own scores of warriors and porters. By the spring of 1521, Cortés was ready. He had replenished his Spanish force to around 600 men, augmented by the survivors of Narvaez's expedition, and he commanded an indigenous army that swelled to at least 50,000 warriors from Tlaxcala and other allied cities. The Aztec Empire, meanwhile, was reeling from plague and political fragmentation. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in late May, a 93-day ordeal that would test the limits of human endurance on both sides. Cortés divided his forces into 3 divisions, each assigned to one of the main causeways to the city Tlacopan, Tepeyac, and Iztapalapa. The brigantines, launched into the lake with sails catching the wind, swept the waters clear of Aztec war canoes. The ships were a psychological as well as a military shock. The Aztecs had never seen such vessels moving against the wind, and their cannon fire shattered the elegant pirogues that had once ruled the lake. The blockade was established, and the slow strangulation of the island capital commenced. The Tlaxcalan warriors, accustomed to quick raids and ritual combat, now found themselves in a grinding siege. They slept on the causeways in makeshift shelters, enduring the cold nights and the constant threat of Aztec canoes. Their women and children often accompanied them, bringing food and carrying away the wounded. The Allied camps became small cities of their own, filled with the smoke of cooking fires and the sounds of war chants. For the Spanish, the ordeal was equally brutal. They suffered from tropical diseases, as well as from the psychological strain of fighting in such close quarters against a relentless foe. Day after day, the Spanish and their allies pushed across the causeways, fighting for every foot of ground. The Aztecs, under Cuauhtémoc's fierce leadership, mounted a desperate defense. They tore up the causeway pavements, constructing barricades and pitfalls to halt the advance. They launched swift attacks from canoes at night, sometimes dragging prisoners away for sacrifice on the Temple Mayor itself, a grisly theater of defiance that the Allies could see from a distance. The Spanish, for all their steel and gunpowder, found that their native allies bore the brunt of the fighting. The Tlaxcalans, eager to settle old scores, charged with maniacal fury, while other indigenous groups, recently allied, sought to prove their loyalty by spilling Aztec blood. The city became a grinder of flesh and bone. Inside Tenochtitlan, conditions grew apocalyptic. Population, swollen by refugees from surrounding towns, faced starvation. The blockade cut off all supplies of food and fresh water. The aqueduct that once brought spring water from Chapultepec was severed, and the city's reservoirs became brackish and foul. The Aztecs, once masters of a vast trade network, were reduced to eating roots, insects, and even the leather and bark from their roofs. The great market of Tlatelolco, once filled with exotic goods, now lay empty and silent. Cortés allowed some women and children to leave, but many were too terrified or devoted to abandon their city. Spanish eyewitnesses later recounted seeing the streets piled with corpses and the stench of death hanging over the lake. Disease continued its merciless harvest, with smallpox and now dysentery ravaging the weakened population. Yet the Aztecs refused to surrender. Cuauhtémoc, in a show of unwavering defiance, executed any who spoke of capitulation. In these moments of unimaginable suffering, one might pause and wonder, what would you have done if you were inside those walls watching your family starve as the enemy tightened its grip and the world you knew crumbled into dust? The question hung heavy over the city, but surrender was not in their code. The final assault began in early August. Cortés decided to press into the heart of the city, the sacred precinct of Tlatelolco, where the last defenders had congregated. The fighting became house to house, with the Spanish systematically demolishing buildings to fill canals and eliminate rooftop archers. The brigantines provided close support, cannonading the last Aztec strongholds. The Tlaxcalans, driven by a mix of vengeance and the promise of plunder, were relentless. Bernal Diaz later described the scene as a hell on earth, with canals clogged with bodies and the water dyed red with blood. The The Aztec warriors, dressed in their finest battle regalia, knew they were fighting for their very existence. They fought with clubs edged with obsidian, spears, and arrows, often facing certain death. In the final hours, Cuauhtémoc, clad in the regalia of an eagle warrior, fought on foot in the narrow streets, his obsidian-edged sword clattering against Spanish steel, until his own nobles finally forced him onto a canoe in a last attempt to escape. On August 13, 1521, the Spanish brigantines cornered the canoe as he attempted to flee across the lake. His capture was the signal of total defeat. To be problem and fact, according to Cortés' own letters, the young emperor, dressed in a simple mantle, approached the conquistador and, through an interpreter, spoke words of profound resignation. "I have done all I could to defend my city and my people, and I can do no more. Do with me as you will." It was a moment of tragic dignity, the fall of a civilization summed up in a single heartbreaking gesture. The fighting ceased, but the horror was not over. It was not. For 3 more days, the Allies and Spanish sacked the city, raping, killing, and taking prisoners. The Spanish, now joined by a horde of native allies eager for revenge and plunder, went through the city looting anything of value. Gold, feathers, and precious stones were ripped from temples and palaces. The Tlaxcalans in particular seized countless captives to be sacrificed or enslaved in their own ceremonies, a grim irony for those who claimed to fight for liberation. The death toll was staggering. Possibly over 200,000 people had perished from battle, starvation, and disease. The once great Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, its temples toppled, its canals choked with debris. The stench of decomposition made it unbearable to remain. Cortés, ever the pragmatist, ordered the city cleansed and rebuilt as the capital of New Spain. The rebuild of Tenochtitlan's temples was used to build a new Christian city, its cathedrals rising on the foundations of the old gods. Native laborers, many of them former Aztec subjects, were forced into the backbreaking work. The lake itself began to be drained as the Spanish found the watery terrain unsuitable for their horses and carts. Within a decade, the Venice of the New World had begun its transformation into the orderly, grid-patterned Mexico City. The conquest was complete, but the question of betrayal loomed large. What became of the Tlaxcalans after their great gamble? In the immediate aftermath, they were rewarded handsomely. Cortés recognized their special status, exempting them from many of the harshest tributes and granting their nobility the right to carry swords and ride horses, privileges normally reserved for Europeans. Tlaxcala became a privileged enclave within the new colonial order, a status it would leverage for centuries. Its warriors served as auxiliaries in later Spanish campaigns, marching as far south as Guatemala to subdue other indigenous groups. Yet was that the full story? The alliance had been one of convenience, and the Tlaxcalans soon found that their new masters were not so different from the old. The Spanish, with their insatiable demand for labor and land, gradually encroached on native autonomy. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to native labor, was extended even to regions that had been friendly. Though Tlaxcala fared better than many, it could not escape the broader colonial transformation. Franciscan and Dominican friars arrived, and the people were converted, often forcibly, to Christianity, their ancient temples demolished to build churches. The very fabric of Tlaxcalan society was rewoven into a Spanish colonial mold, and by the late 1500s, the same patterns of land loss and labor exploitation that plagued other indigenous communities began to creep into Tlaxcala. In the larger sweep of history, the alliance between Cortés and the Tlaxcalans is a complex legacy. Without their tens of thousands of warriors, the Spanish conquest would have been unthinkable. But the siege of Tenochtitlan was less a Spanish victory than a native rebellion, armed and organized by Europeans, against an imperial center. The Tlaxcalans, by aligning with the outsiders, had exchanged one form of subjugation for another, but for a time they had wielded power and extracted a terrible revenge. Their story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the conquest of Mexico was not a simple tale of European dominance over passive natives. It was a multifaceted, deeply human drama of calculation, desperation, and violence. Indigenous agency lay at its very heart. The Tlaxcalan alliance became a template for future Spanish conquests, as other indigenous groups attempted to replicate their model of collaboration, but it also became a source of deep shame in Mexican history, a constant reminder that the conquest was not solely a European imposition but a complex civil war. Cuauhtémoc, meanwhile, was elevated to legendary status, his defiance celebrated in murals and his name given to streets and towns. The memory of the siege, with its unimaginable suffering and heroism, would echo through the centuries, shaping Mexican identity. As we reflect on this monumental clash, the question echoes through the centuries: what do you think was the single most decisive factor in the Aztec defeat? Spanish technology, native allies, or disease? Explain your reasoning in the comments. And if you found this journey through history illuminating, please give this video a like. It helps others discover these stories. Share this documentary with anyone who thinks they know the full story of the conquest. They'll be surprised. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode that reshapes the way you see the past. Our next documentary will delve into the enigmatic life of Malinche, the indigenous woman who served as Cortés' translator and confidant. Was she a traitor, a survivor, or something more? For more deep dives into the untold chapters of history, check out our channel playlist where we explore the hidden forces that shaped our world. Thank you for watching and keep questioning the stories that define us.